We now welcome Jack Rice. Always good to see him, the former CIA officer, criminal defense attorney, and host of his own radio show as well. Jack, what's your reaction to the Obama Oval Address on Monday night?
Well, Larry, it's clear that some of the polls have come out and the American people are not real happy about how things are going right now. We've seen both left and right have been very clear that they wanted to see more from the president. The president tried to come out and give a little bit more. I think the problem is what he said essentially is a little more of the same. So I think there's a dilemma on both sides of the aisle right now.
I'm sorry, I said Monday night. He spoke on Sunday night. Well, what didn't he cover? What should he have said, in your opinion?
Well, Larry, here's the problem, and I mean, this is the nature of media, and you understand this better than probably just about anybody, is that we regularly talk about these issues in bumper sticker slogans, in 5-second sound bites, and this is a very complicated, very difficult problem. And I think what it's about is not just about taking out ISIL, because frankly, we could take out ISIL, or we could take out Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or we could take out whoever it is we want to take out. The real question is, what are the circumstances, what is the political environment that allows them to thrive in the first place, and that we have to collectively start going out and stopping that from happening. But see, that's too complicated to put into a 5-second soundbite, so nobody really wants to talk about it. But frankly, that is the reality. That's what we need to be talking about. How do we collectively deal with this problem rather than saying, let's send in more F-22s?
How do you explain a very complicated issue to an audience that just says we don't want to be bombed and stop the bombing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the only way to really approach this is to say, okay, everybody, it's time to take a breath. Let's sit down and let's talk about the environment in the Middle East in general, but let's take a look at why it is that ISIL developed in the first place. Let's look at the power vacuum that actually was created with the last wars in Iraq and what that meant for the Sunni and then the Shia on the other side, and how they're actually funding and fighting off of each other and how the Americans are involved. But then secondly, and I think most importantly, talk about why the Americans must be involved, but how they can't exclusively be on point on this issue, and that there are others who have to step into the room. I think you just need to talk to people like adults, but realize it is more than a 5-second problem, and it has to be addressed as complicated as it is.
What do you think of sending more U.S. Special Forces into a combat zone?
I think sending more special forces in is something that makes sense if what you're going to do is not send in ground troops, because you can help train. But the problem that you have, it really is this, is that, I mean, this is what we're facing. We have the ability to send in a lot more air sorties than we already are, dramatically, in fact. But the problem that we have is we don't have sufficient intelligence to figure out where it is we're supposed to place those bombs. So we have more than enough planes to do this, more than enough equipment, more than enough bombs. Now what we're finding is the French are actually ramping up. The Brits have just agreed, they're ramping up. The Germans have just agreed, they're ramping up. But that doesn't help us with the intelligence standpoint. We still need to figure out exactly what's going on. And now we add this additional wrinkle within the last 24 hours that the Iraqis want the Turks to actually leave northern Iraq because they don't trust them either. We don't have a coalition of the willing, so to speak, to go into and to address this issue. That is maybe the most critical, and it needs to be driven primarily by others in the region who are most affected, including the Saudis, including the Turks, including the Jordanians, and others.
This may be the minority, but what about those who say, why don't we just stay out of it at all? It's not our business. Other countries should be involved. They're closer and involved in the region. Why should we care?
It's a great question, Larry. There's two different reasons. I mean, we could use the humanitarian reason. When you take a look at the tens of thousands of people who have died in these wars already, or the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've actually fled, more than 3 million people have been displaced in the region, and you're seeing this sort of cataclysmic effect with all of the migration that's rolling into Europe that's causing a lot of instability in itself. That's actually having a dramatic impact upon our allies. And so that is a reality. But there is something else here. we are still dependent upon the region. We're still dependent upon the oil that comes out of the Middle East. And what we need is stability in the region to ensure that it continues to flow. And that is a reality. And so as long as we're going to continue to be a world power, as long as we're going to continue to flex our muscles on a worldwide stage, we have to realize that we're going to have to play a role because we have an interest in stability in the region. I mean, that causes a whole heck of a lot of problems too, because we do a whole lot of things that are inconsistent with this claim that we're all about democracy when in fact we aren't.
It's not easy.
No. You know, it's not, Larry. I think here's the biggest problem in the region, and this alludes to what you were asking me earlier about the more complicated issue. The problem is this, is that we claim that we're about democracy in the region, but we're not. What we're about is about stability. If you look at us historically, the United States, I mean, we support the most totalitarian dictators in the region. We support the Saudis. We supported the Egyptians for many years. We did the same thing with the Pakistanis and others. So that's not exactly a shock. So when we turn around and talk about democracy and everybody in the region turns around and says, really? Democracy? How you doing with the Saudis, my brother? When that happens, what you end up getting is the perception that we're hypocrites and that we're talking out of both sides of our mouths. Because, to be really honest, well, we are.
Senator Lindsey Graham and others are saying that a 9/11 style attack is coming to America. How do they know that?
They don't. The problem is this really is reminiscent of Secretary Rice talking about the mushroom cloud over New York or someplace else. I think to make these claims is unreasonable, inappropriate under the circumstances, and is more fear-mongering than anything else. We have to be realistic about the threats that are coming at us. But I think the bottom line is this, Larry. The fact is that ISIL or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, these are not existential threats. They cannot take down the United States. What we have found after 9/11 is that the United States overreacted to events and created, in some cases, more enemies than we actually destroyed. And that's one of the problems that we have. We need to recognize that the threat that is out there, and it is real, needs to be addressed appropriately and as carefully and with as minute care as possible so we don't actually increase the number of people who hate us. That's critically important in this case.
Does San Bernardino add to the fear?
Of course it does. And it does because I think for the United States, people will look at what's going on in the world and say, that's their problem. Let them deal with it. And the thing is we're in the region. We're acting in our own interest over there. But when it happens here, when it happens in the United States, all of a sudden, it becomes magically our problem. Frankly, it's our problem when we're there. It's our problem because our interests are there too. So when they come here, and it was inevitable, I think it's only reasonable that people feel that way, but they also need to recognize that we need to still act accordingly and with the balanced care to make sure that we convince the vast majority of the Muslim world or any place else we're operating that we're not there against them. We actually have very similar interests that they have.
Thanks, Jack. We'll have you back real soon.
Thank you so much, Larry.
Always a great guest. Jack Rice, criminal defense attorney, former CIA covert officer, and host of The Jack Rice Show.